Social justice education, I believe, needs a permanent place in the academy. It offers one avenue for how those inside the academy can speak to those outside the academy. At the same time, it creates an opportunity for broader engagement with ideas emerging from scholarly research. Academic ideas are not isolated from the outside world, and the academic sphere does not have a monopoly on intellectualism.
My name is Marcy Harris, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's event with Premilla Nadasen for discussion of her book, Household Workers Unite, The Untold Story of African American Women Who Built a Movement. Premilla has been a longtime scholar and activist who has worked closely with domestic workers' rights organizations. She is an associate professor of history at Barnard College at Columbia University and is the author of the award-winning book Welfare Warriors, the Welfare Rights Movement in the United States.
The opening epigraph of my book is a quote by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and it reads, "What matters in life is not what happens to you, but what you remember and how you remember it." In many ways, this book is about historical memory, especially the connection between historical memory and social change. In 2007, a landscape contractor in the exclusive New York City suburb of Muttontown on Long Island was sitting in his truck after purchasing a box of donuts when a malnourished, bedraggled woman approached him. Barely speaking English, the woman pointed frantically to her stomach and begged him to give her a donut. The woman, as was later learned through media accounts, was a household worker, one of two live-in Indonesian workers who had been virtually imprisoned and literally tortured by their employers for 5 years. They were beaten with rolling pins, scalded with boiling water, force-fed chili peppers, required to sleep on the floor in a closet, and only allowed to leave the house to take out the garbage. The employers, a wealthy married couple, were eventually brought to trial, convicted, fined, and sent to jail. This widely publicized case, an extreme but not isolated incident, rightly drew condemnation from many quarters and became emblematic of the vulnerability of private household workers, their isolation, their status as marginalized, and in this case non-citizen workers, and the vastly unequal power relations that characterize the occupation. Buried in the sensational news coverage was the fact that an organization of South Asian workers, Ondalan, had learned of the case and had begun to advocate on behalf of the workers. Ondalan collaborated with Domestic Workers Unite to organize a public demonstration in front of the courthouse as the trial took place. Founded in 2000 and composed of nannies, cleaners, and elder care workers, Domestic Workers Unite is a multiracial organization that adopted the slogan, Tell them slavery done. Based in New York City, it holds rallies, organizes pickets, lobbies the legislature, and brings lawsuits on behalf of workers to improve labor conditions. Ondalan, Domestic Workers United, and other organizations in this active and vocal household workers movement are frequently overlooked in the media, while the victimization stories, like that of the Indonesian workers, dominate. Stories of domestic workers who need rescuing often appear in the popular press and circulate through the internet. In short, the image of the disempowered and abused domestic worker is a common one, evoking pity and outrage. This book tells a story of household worker activism from the 1950s to the 1970s, a pivotal period during which domestic workers established a national movement to transform the occupation. It is a story of women, primarily women of color, who have for the most part operated in the shadows of the formal labor movement, on the margins of the struggle for Black freedom, and under the heels of the mainstream women's movement. It challenges widespread assumptions about the passivity of domestic workers and paints a markedly different picture of household workers, one in which they do not need a savior. But it does more than that. It analyzes their strategies of mobilization and explores how storytelling was central to the way they organized and developed a political agenda. Household worker activists shared stories that were passed down to them and told stories of their own experiences as workers. Their stories, which they connected to the struggle for Black liberation, highlighted the racial exploitation of the labor and were part of a collective remembered history in the African American community. Storytelling was a form of activism, a strategic way to make sense of the past as well as the present, and to overturn assumptions about domestic workers. One of the stories that came up over and over again as I was researching this book was the story of the slave markets. And these were locations during the Great Depression where black domestic workers stood on street corners to be hired as day laborers. And it was common among women who organized in the 60s and the 70s to recount the history of the slave markets, even though they themselves had never experienced the slave market. But the slave market came to represent a symbol of the exploitation in the occupation. And one of the women who talked about the slave market quite a lot was a woman named Geraldine Miller, who organized in New York City. Searching for something better, in 1954, Miller relocated to New York City, where she ended up doing mainly domestic work and living in the Bronx on Morris Avenue, a short distance from the site of the most notorious slave markets of the Depression. She recounted hearing stories from women who stood on Burnside Avenue, waiting to be selected for cleaning jobs. As she explained, quote, "Sometimes they'd ask to see your knees, and the women with the worst scarred knees were hired first because they looked like they worked the hardest." And Miller shared the story of the slave market, partly as a way to advocate reform and to establish standards for the occupation, suggesting that household workers would never again scrub floors on their hands and knees. Living and working conditions for domestic workers were typically very difficult in the post-war period. They were denied basic labor rights, including minimum wage and the right to organize and bargain collectively. Carolyn Reed, who was an organizer in New York, described her first live-in job. When she arrived in New York in the mid-1950s, Reed perused the newspaper ads and found a live-in position in East Meadow, Long Island, working from 7:30 a.m. until 9 p.m. for $15 a week. The family had 2 children who were so unruly that they turned Reed off from motherhood. As she explained, "I've never seen brats like that in my life. Maybe that's why I made a conscious decision not to have children." The family was, quote, kind and everything, but they worked the shit out of me. And although she was hired to take care of the children, she ended up also doing the washing, the cooking, and the cleaning. Reed's room was a tiny space in the basement near the furnace. That's when I realized that we were supposed to be poor, and I was really upset for the first couple of nights having to be there. The cramped quarters were compounded by isolation. As she explained, I was very lonely. Reed worked for the family for 2 years. And as she said, "One day I brought the children home from school and I walked out of that house and I never went back. I never said a word to anyone, I just left. I've learned a lot in those 20 years, and what I've learned most is we've got to organize." The idea that domestic workers were, quote unquote, one of the family was a dominant theme in this occupation, and I think in some places still is a dominant theme. And this often translated into employer expectations that workers would work extra hours, would accept hand-me-downs instead of payment, or would simply labor because they loved the family. The employer claims to kinship were rarely genuine, and in any case were not reciprocal. And although domestic workers were expected to carry out familial responsibilities, they were rarely accorded familial rights, such as using the front door, sitting at the dinner table, or being properly fed. The question of food was a recurring one. Food served to workers was often poor quality, leftover, or simply not enough. Geraldine Miller recalled being offered food that was inedible. "I've had sandwiches where the cheese was so hard I could throw it and hit you in the head and hurt you." Moreover, domestic workers were not interested in building these sorts of familial relationships. Bolden and others wanted to be treated as workers. They saw their work as rooted in a labor market transaction, not an emotional connection. For household workers, the language of care and kin masked their central concerns of rights and responsibilities. As Carolyn Reed, who became a national leader in the movement, put it, "I don't need a family, I only want a job." The larger context of the civil rights movement was an important catalyst for domestic worker organizing, and this was perhaps most evident with the Montgomery bus boycott, where domestic workers played a critical role not only as foot soldiers, but as leaders, and Georgia Gilmore was one of those leaders. As became clear early on, the boycott in Montgomery was expensive to run and maintain. Coordination was a massive undertaking and included fundraising, publicity, legal representation, security patrols, as well as the providing of alternative transportation in the form of an organized carpool for protesters. The Montgomery Improvement Association needed money to operate the carpool and assist people who had been arrested, fined, or fired for their participation in the protest. The carpool was an extensive citywide network with 300 vehicles and 42 pickup and drop-off points. Coordinators rented or borrowed vehicles, hired drivers, and paid for gas and insurance. Gilmore looked for a way that she could best help out. According to Johnny Carr, a member of the Women's Political Council and longtime friend of Rosa Parks, Georgia just got into her mind that she was going to raise money for the movement. And if Georgia was raising money, she was doing it through food. Gilmore recounted, "We collected $14 from amongst ourselves and bought some chickens, bread, and lettuce. Started cooking and made up a bundle of sandwiches for the big rally. We had a lot of our club members who were hard-pressed and couldn't give more than a quarter or $half, but all knew how to raise money. We started selling sandwiches and went from there to selling full dinners in our neighborhoods, and we'd bake pies and cakes for people." Gilmore founded the Club from Nowhere, an organization of maids, service workers, and cooks seeking to aid the boycott. The name was an attempt to shield the members from the consequences of openly supporting the boycott. Some colored folks or Negroes could afford to stick out their necks more than others because they had independent incomes, Gilmore explained, but some just couldn't afford to be called ringleaders and have the white folks fire them. So when we made our financial reports to the Montgomery Improvement Association officers, we had them record us as the money coming from nowhere, the club from nowhere. And only Gilmore knew who made and bought the food and who donated the money. The underground network of cooks went door to door, selling sandwiches, pies, and cakes and collecting money. The proceeds were then turned over to boycott leaders, and donations came from whites as well as blacks. The campaign spread to other neighborhoods. According to Gilmore, well, in order to make the mass meeting and the boycott be a success and keep the carpool running, we decided that the peoples on the south side would get a club and the peoples on the west side would get a club. The various groups competed, each trying to raise more money than the other. When we'd raised as much as $300 for a Monday night rally, then we'd known we was on our way for $500 on Thursday night. Gilmore offered the money at the Monday night mass meetings to wild cheers and thunderous applause. Household labor was a particularly difficult occupation to organize. Domestic workers labored in isolated settings in the ostensibly private space of the home. So through their organizing, domestic workers developed rather innovative strategies that centered on public spaces in particular, and Dorothy Bolden, who was an organizer in Atlanta, perhaps best illustrates this. Bolden launched her initiative at a moment that seemed ripe for change. Public transportation, where domestic workers mingled on their way to work, was an important location for organizing. Most cities were racially segregated, and the typical pattern was for domestics to board buses in black neighborhoods early in the morning to make the journey to white areas. Domestic worker organizers handed out flyers at bus stops and initiated conversations with other workers while riding the buses to work. There was, according to Julian Bond, a network of maids created by the transportation routes. Maids from around the city boarded buses going downtown, where they transferred to get to their places of employment. This transfer point became a meeting ground, a hub of organizing, and Dorothy Bolden was the center of it. To galvanize support, Bolden rode every city bus line and spoke to hundreds of maids. I would go around in the bus and ask maids how they would feel about joining if we could organize, and they would say, "I'm for that." So city buses became impromptu mobile meeting grounds. These freedom buses were comparable to the rural freedom schools of the 1960s, sites for political education and organizing, as well as consciousness raising. They were venues where poor women could share grievances and concerns, trade stories of abuse, exchange information about wages and workload, and learn about their rights. In this way, individual domestic workers engaged in labor that was private in nature, but became part of a very public effort. Bringing honor, recognition, and respect to this occupation, revaluing household labor, was one of the key goals of household worker organizing. In 1970, Dorothy Bolden and the National Domestic Workers Union of America in Atlanta established Maids Honor Day to recognize the contributions of domestic workers. Employers were asked to submit letters of nomination explaining why their maid should be named Maid of the Year. The purpose of this event, the NDWUA announced, is to recognize and honor outstanding women in the field of domestic labor for their courage and stability and the remarkable ability of being able to take care of two households at one time. The Maids Honor Day banquet was held annually in May, and the celebration included distinguished speakers, citations, awards, and a benediction. Maids Honor Day, which sought to bring respect and recognition to an occupation that was both undervalued and underpaid, was part of a broader campaign to improve working conditions for domestic laborers. The struggle for dignity was part and parcel of the struggle for rights. For poor Black women who scrubbed other people's floors, the banquet was a rare opportunity to dress up in their finest attire, enjoy a lavish dinner, and publicly take pride in who they were. Even workers who did not win the honor of Maid of the Year undoubtedly benefited from basking in the praise of their employers. Professionalization and training were also important in this movement. And Mary McClendon, who was an organizer and activist, who was born in Alabama and began domestic work at the age of 9, but moved to Detroit in the 1950s, really took on this issue of professionalization and training. The center of McClendon's work in Detroit was the training programs. She, like other domestic workers, believed that the category of household labor was a catch-all label that masked domestic workers' many roles. She insisted on spelling out the multiple kinds of household tasks and expertise necessary for each. In a training manual, McClendon delineated the following areas of specialization: general housekeeping technician, kitchen manager, child supervisor, home geriatric aide, party supervisor, and household manager. She developed 9 different courses, one in job readiness, which taught basic remedial skills, attitude, rights, and benefits, as well as grooming and personal experience. Home safety and sanitation included first aid, accident prevention, insect and pest control, and handling food and toxic materials. The course on home geriatrics covered psychology of the elderly, home nursing, and recreational therapy. McClendon defined a household technician as a person with a college-level vocational training for employment in private households. She also counseled domestic workers to set boundaries on what they would do. Household work would include picking up toys off the floor, cleaning cobwebs, mopping, dusting, and polishing, which were all acceptable. But as she put it, but we tell them not to pick up personal underwear. I would also like to say a few words about history and organizing. And how this movement relied on history and constructed historical narratives, but also how they shaped the emerging field of women's history and Black women's history in particular. History has always been important in the struggle for domestic worker rights. As the struggle of the 1970s illustrates, the family lore passed down in household workers' families, the collective memory crafted from African American women's history, and the shared personal histories facilitated the development of a mass movement. If their personal experiences were the building blocks of the movement, the process of sharing, of storytelling, was a cement that fused those blocks into a larger whole. Stories of the slave markets, stories of Rosa Parks, and stories of struggle and empowerment circulated among household workers in the 1970s. By 1980, the National Committee on Household Employment began to more consciously acknowledge the importance of the history of organizing among household workers and embrace the example of working-class Black women's resistance. These household workers seemed acutely aware of the historical significance of their organizing and how it fit into a broader trajectory of activism among domestic workers. In addition, as the academic field of Black women's history emerged, they attempted to shape the larger narrative and carve out a space for a distinctive working-class perspective on African American women. Although not scholars, they claimed an investment in scholarly interventions. Carolyn Reed, who headed the national organization at the time, also initiated a project called Our Right to Know that encouraged household workers to gather and record their own history and family stories that were passed down from generation to generation. And so the project she initiated was called Our Right to Know. The director of that project wrote in the organization's newsletter, quote, "The most important part of the project are household workers themselves. Each and every technician has a lifetime of experiences that individually and collectively make up a rich history that deserves documentation. These life histories will draw a picture of household employment today. They will connect us with our past and guide us in the future." To conclude, I just want to talk a little bit about sort of why I wrote this book and my own connection to the organizing and the activism that informs this book in so many ways. Over the past 10 years, I've been very deeply engaged with domestic worker organizing in New York City and tried to be as supportive as I can. And so I think of this book partly as a product of what I call socially engaged scholarship. That is scholarship that is connected to organizing, that I hope will make a difference, and that I think speaks to organizing today, but is also deeply informed and inspired by the organizing that I see around me. Since entering the academy, I have been drawn to a social justice approach to writing and teaching, meaning that I gravitate to topics that have relevance to ordinary people. I try to offer perspectives that are less likely to be part of the academic or popular discourse, perspectives that I believe will enrich rather than supplant how issues are discussed. This also means that I stay connected to contemporary activists, both because I'm committed to social transformation and because I learn from their advocacy and hope to offer my skills and my support in return. Social justice education, I believe, needs a permanent place in the academy. It offers one avenue for how those inside the academy can speak to those outside the academy. At the same time, it creates an opportunity for broader engagement with ideas emerging from scholarly research. Academic ideas are not isolated from the outside world, and the academic sphere does not have a monopoly on intellectualism. My participation in grassroots organizing has also convinced me that academic scholarship matters. I have been an ally of the contemporary struggle for domestic worker rights since I first learned about the vibrant movement of household workers and their frequent demonstrations on the streets of New York about 10 years ago. As a scholar activist, I simultaneously buried myself in archival material and made an effort to attend domestic worker meetings, and was struck by the use of storytelling in both venues. Contemporary participants reminded me very much of the women who populate this book, mature women with life experience and a very sharp political analysis. So in that spirit of socially engaged scholarship, we do have some members of a domestic worker rights group here in Massachusetts, Matahari, which has really been at the forefront of the movement in Boston and Massachusetts to push for a domestic worker Bill of Rights. So I would like to ask Angela and Ivy to come up, if you could, and talk a little bit about some of the organizing work that you're doing.
My name is Angela Foster. I'm a nanny and I'm a leader with Matahari. I want to thank you for having us. I came from Jamaica in 2000 and I got my first nanny job then. I knew nothing about what my job functions would be because I was in the corporate world back home. Nevertheless, I took the job. With much coaching from my employer and another nanny friend named Donnie, I became a pro and a household name. Since then, I've nannied 23 children in the Boston area. A friend told me about National Nanny Training Day. And although I was always at a quest for knowledge, it was a Saturday and I have a gazillion amount of stuff to do, so reluctantly I went. It was 8 hours, but I could have stayed longer. I was beyond words to say how elated I was. For years I've worked as a nanny, and yet this was the first time I'd had to come together with so many nannies. There were over 150 of us. It was like a nanny conference. We attended classes on everything like pediatric nutrition, child development, because we were professional nannies. I was taught that I had rights as a nanny, even if I'm being undocumented. Matahari is a social justice organization of families where we organize as families, women of color and immigrant women who organize as sisters for personal and societal transformation. Our mission is to end gender-based violence and exploitation. Matahari is Domestic Workers Human Resource Center because we don't have an HR, right? So we need Matahari. So because domestic workers, we work in isolation, we are often not thought about and was excluded from the traditional workforce, thus making us vulnerable to exploitation. As part of Matahari and the Massachusetts Coalition for Domestic Workers, we have fought for and won more rights for domestic workers. In 2014, we passed the Massachusetts Domestic Worker Bill of Rights, which extends new rights to nannies, caregivers, and house cleaners. January was Human Trafficking Awareness Month, and we celebrated by presenting the findings of the first nanny ever census. The census revealed the disparity in wages and labor standards for nannies in Boston. Some nannies were paid as little as $4.44 an hour, way below the minimum wage. And 75% of nannies were not paid the time and a half to which they are entitled for overtime. We've been working with the Attorney General's office to educate and enforce labor protections. There is one thing I want to share with you. You spoke about Barbara Bolden in the 1970s in Georgia. Well, this is a letter from Melania Cass. I think everybody here is familiar with Melania Cass Boulevard. She was an African-American former domestic worker who fought for more rights for us in the 70s. And this is a letter that she wrote to Governor Sargent. I'll pass it around if you want, or I can read it. It says, "Dear Governor Sargent, on your desk is House Bill number 5797 to be signed. It is a product of the Women's Service Club, very diligent and consistent efforts to make this a reality. We have sponsored projects to assist these women and men, especially Black, who for many years were relegated to household work because of discriminatory practices, customs, etc. They were exploited, as you know. We are determined that this shall pass and that these forgotten workers will share in the benefits of all other workers, especially in their categories." And she said, "Will you sign it?" This is from Melnica. So, as I said, thank you for inviting us, and we invite you also to join us in educating and organizing workers and employers. Thank you.
Isn't she good? Okay, my name is Ivy James, and I am a leader with Matahari also. I've been a nanny, night nurse for approximately 28 years, take care of hundreds of children. I came to the US in 1987 as a college student and did domestic work to help pay for my expenses. In my country, the whole village raises a child and looks out for our elders. I babysat from the time I was 7 years old and loved it. Now I do child care as my career. I got involved in Matahari through outreach. Julia, our outreach organizer, met me at a local park when I was out with my charges. I was very skeptical and not convinced after 20 minutes. I decided to follow up by attending a neighborhood meeting, and from then on, I hit the ground running. Now I speak at Fight for 15 rallies, to employers, synagogues, and do lots of outreach to nannies and other domestic workers. Like our sister did decades ago, we speak to domestic workers in parks, playgrounds, and at train stations. We let them know about their rights and invite them to upcoming meetings. As soon as the weather gets warmer, we will train new Matahari members how to do outreach and continue with the tradition.
I actually also wanted to ask if you could talk briefly about the Massachusetts Bill of Rights for domestic workers and why that was so important in terms of the milestone for setting a pattern. It wasn't the first, but it is actually one of the most important bills of rights that has been passed.
Okay.
Okay. Well, there were challenges, of course, facing domestic workers, and this came to light over the last year with the adoption of the Domestic Worker Bill of Rights. And that requires a written contract a written agreement between employer and employee. And this also extends more protections, such as the right to a day off, break for meals, and adequate sleeping quarters for living household help. We also, maternity leave. Domestic workers were not really guaranteed maternity leave. When you get pregnant, you have to stop working, find another job. But the new bill gives you right for maternity leave. And the Domestic Worker Bill of Rights is state-level legislation. Why is the Domestic Worker Bill of Rights important? Let's ask that question. The Fair Labor Standard Act, history of exclusion, vulnerability to abuse and mistreatment, isolation from the workforce, and a workplace without protections against unsafe working conditions, discrimination, and sexual harassment. As we said, we work in isolation, so whatever is happening to us, we keep it inside. But it has to be said, right? It has to go out there. So that is why we, along with the Massachusetts Coalition, fought for domestic workers. And these are some of the rights that we are entitled to. Ivy, you wanna?
We have the right to be paid for all working time. Okay, anytime domestic worker is required to be on employer's premises or on duty, we are expected to be paid for that.
Let me explain that part of it. As nannies, sometimes you have nannies who live in. The baby wakes up, they have to get up, right? A lot of families don't want to pay them for the night. But if you're there and the baby wakes up, if the baby wakes up 2, 3, one time, you have to be paid the full night.
Okay. We have a right to days of rest. For an employee who's working 40 hours a week, an employer must provide at least 24 consecutive hours of rest. In that's an employee who doing live-in work. They have to have 24 hours of consecutive rest. Okay, food. Domestic workers does not have to pay for food and beverages unless food and beverages is voluntary or freely chosen. There is a written agreement between the employer and the domestic worker stating cost of food. domestic workers have the ability to easily bring or prepare own food as she wanted. Okay, lodging. Domestic workers does not have to pay for lodging unless lodging is voluntarily or freely accepted. Domestic workers actually desires and uses the lodging, and there is a written agreement between domestic workers and employer. Privacy. Employer cannot restrict, interfere with or monitor domestic workers' private communication.
They're entitled to have their cameras, but not to record their voices.
Protection against trafficking. Employer cannot engage in sexual trafficking or domestic workers or labor trafficking, called forced services. We are entitled to a written agreement, the rate of pay, including overtime, and overtime meaning anything over 40 hours, it's time and a half.
Based on all of the research that you put into the book and your kind of knowledge about the success that domestic workers have had in the organizing efforts, and from what the two of you know about what's actually going on the ground here and what it took to actually get that passed, how could we get something like this implemented at the national level or across state levels? Do you have any idea of how something like that might be able to happen so that women and other domestic workers outside of Massachusetts might be able to benefit from the same kind of...
There are struggles for domestic worker Bill of Rights across the country in different states right now, Connecticut, Illinois. There have been 5 states that have passed domestic worker bills of rights. So it's an ongoing struggle. The question of how to do it on a federal level is a more difficult one. There was just a recent victory last August where the Department of Labor finally included home health care workers in federal minimum wage legislation. And it's kind of a shame that it was only in the year 2015 that home health care aides were finally entitled to federal minimum wage. So, you know, it's a big struggle, and I'm not sure if it's possible for federal level legislation around this issue. You know, one of the things that's really important to think about, and I think Ivy mentioned this about her involvement with the Fight for 15 movement, is that this is one sector of a growing mass of low-wage workers who are increasingly exploited and who are increasingly finding it more and more difficult to make ends meet. And I think the direction we seem to be moving in is fewer rights for workers, fewer benefits for workers, less pension, and less time off. And so I think the work that Matahari is doing and other organizations like that is so important because it's really a pushback against that larger trend, but it really does require all of us supporting organizations like this and doing the work ourselves.
How long did it take for the Bill of Rights to finally get passed here in Massachusetts, or was it I'm sure it was a long struggle, but...
It wasn't, well, we surveyed over 500 people, and we did role plays just like what we just did for the nanny census, and we came up with what more rights and protections domestic workers needed. And those are some of the rights that we came up with. We got some of them we didn't, because we got the earned sick time law, but for a nanny or a domestic worker, you have protected sick time, but unpaid. Because the earned sick time is if you have employees that are 10 and over, then you have earned sick time law. But nannies or domestic workers, we don't have that many people working together. Have to be in a mansion or something, right?
You said something about, and I've read most of the book, but not the whole thing, so maybe it's in there, but just kind of how the women who are doing this work really had a sense, they're really interested in history and kind of the history that they could build off of. I'm just sort of curious where they were. Was it sort of like passed on orally, some of these stories, and just kind of in the tradition of organizing, or like more formal education around that? Just kind of curious how those stories really were passed on from that like Depression era organizing to the 60s and 70s.
Yeah, most of their connection to history happened informally. So it was, it was the context of the civil rights movement. So people had read about or heard about Rosa Parks and knew about her involvement. They knew about women in the Montgomery bus boycott. And so it was that history, but it was also the family stories that were passed down. So one of the things that comes up over and over again is the ways in which their mothers and their grandmothers talked about this labor and what this labor meant to them. In the case of Geraldine Miller, in terms of the Bronx slave market, was the people who she worked with or the people she lived near who talked about the Bronx slave market. So it happened mostly informally, and it was a sense of how they had come to understand domestic labor in the context of African American women's history. Great. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Coming to the woods hadn't been an exercise or a retreat. It wasn't something to take notes on and jar for later, like summer berries. I needed to live without the need of putting on a face for anyone, including myself.